Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our study in Acts, and we're going to pick up in chapter number 21 where we left off last week, which is basically coming to the conclusion of the third missionary journey that Paul had taken as a free man. And so we're going to back up and reread a few of the verses that we actually did expository on last week. And we're going to start with Paul's arrival in Jerusalem. And so just to refresh everyone, Paul has went on his third missionary journey through much of the same territory that he has already covered before. In every one of his missionary journeys, Paul visited the churches that he later writes to from Galatia. And so everyone should be somewhat familiar with that reality and circumstances surrounding those particular churches. But he advanced through to Ephesus and spent 3 years in Ephesus. And then he set out to go and revisit the churches that he started on his second missionary journey throughout Macedonia. And so Luke doesn't give us a whole lot of information and a whole lot of details about what took place like he did on the second missionary journey. But we do follow him, as you see on the map, ultimately to Corinth. And then he starts tracing back by way of land because of the plot against him to end his life by the Jews there. And so he goes back and ends up selling to Miletus. And there at Miletus, he reveals to the elders that he had called from Ephesus to meet him in Miletus. And he told them basically that he was going to Jerusalem and he knew that he would never see them again. And so you have this scene where they're embracing one another and saying their goodbyes. And then Paul sets sail towards the ultimate destination of Jerusalem. And you can see that we have covered that last week. And ultimately he comes to Tyre, where he embraces the local disciples there, in which obviously the Holy Spirit has revealed to Paul and others what is awaiting Paul when he gets to Jerusalem. And in response to that, there's a little bit of peer pressure that is placed on Paul, in that in natural response to the revelation of the Holy Spirit that if Paul goes to Jerusalem, that things aren't going to go well for him, his friends and companions warn him not to go to Jerusalem. But Paul had already set his face to go to Jerusalem, just like Christ had in his ministry. And Paul knew that it was God's will to go to Jerusalem, even though danger and trouble awaited him, which again is a testament to the resolve and the determination and the made-up mind that Paul had in his missionary journeys and his willingness to suffer. I mean, how many people do we know that would be like Paul, that knows that when you go to Jerusalem, it's going to be a very hostile environment? You know what they've done to Christ. You was an eyewitness in the consenting to the stoning and the murder of Stephen and others. And so Paul knows what awaits him, and he's determined not to be delayed or detracted from going there. And so he leaves Tyre and he goes to Caesarea. And there Agabus gives the prophecy by the Holy Spirit that, you know, you're going to be bound when you go to Jerusalem. And again, Paul is determined. I'm still going. And all of this, if we reflect back on the earlier chapters, is around the timing of what? Pentecost, which is unique because, as I've pointed out several times, it's very much a mirror reading in Peter's ministry and in Paul's. And their ministries are very much a reflection of and a mirror reading of the ministry of Christ. So there's a lot of very neat parallels that Luke draws together throughout his writings, and truly he is very gifted in his way and style of writing and tying things together. So as we zoom in here, he travels from Caesarea down to Jerusalem. Arrangements were made for him to have a place to stay on his journey there. And then in verse 17, we're going to pick up, and we're just going to read until where we ended up last week, and then I'll start doing some explanation. Okay, so are you with me? It says, and when we were come to Jerusalem, again, Luke is in first person again here, which clearly shows that he has been with Paul since they left Philippi, leaving Macedonia on their way back by Miletus, Ephesus, and ultimately here. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, James being the brother of Jesus, and all the elders were present. Again, Peter, John, they are apostles who have went out at this point. And verse 19 says, and when we had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee that you teach all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Now we know that this is not true at all, because Paul even has Timothy to be circumcised because he is a half-Jew, which makes him a Jew, being from Galatia. So there's very much a misrepresentation of the ministry of Paul, elements of truth in things that he would have preached, things that he would have shared. But certainly he has opponents that have twisted and manipulated his teaching as if Paul is full-blown against Judaism. In particular, he is telling other Jews to totally forsake everything to do with Torah, which if you read Paul's own writings, again, in the historiography that we have here in Acts, you know that is clearly not true, and there are accusations. But in response to that, and in response to the growing hostility against the Christian movement of the mother church there in Jerusalem, the elders of the church try to negotiate with Paul to do something that will show that Paul is not doing the things that he has been accused of. Okay, so there's a little bit of damage control. And honestly, there's probably an element of the mother church not wanting to gain further persecution of themselves as well. Okay, because again, you have this Judaism, Christianity tension. There's a lot of headbutting going on. Things are getting very tense here. And so they're at a boiling point. And so it says in verse 22, what is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that you are come. In other words, news travels fast. Everyone's going to know you're here. Do therefore this that we say to you. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. And again, this would probably be a Nazirite vow. Take and purify yourselves with them, and be at charges with them. In other words, pay their expenses at the end of their Nazirite vow consummation that would take place at the temple. All of this, again, to prove that he is not teaching Jews to forsake Torah. Okay? And so, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. And then he clarifies the position of the early church here. And we've seen this in Acts 15 in the Jerusalem Council. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication. Okay? Verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple. So let me see if I can pull up a map here. Okay, we have two maps here. If you want to look at the screen to your right, you can see a closer... Oh, so you just jump screens if you want to? You'll see that?
Yeah.
Oh, this map set just makes my computer squeal. Let's try to do this without killing the whole thing. Okay, if you want to look back on the close-up of the temple, you can see the inner workings of the temple, and you could see where they would have entered in to the main part of the temple here. And so, let me pull that over here. So Paul is willing to do this, which, by the way, is amazing. After everything that Paul's been through in all of his missionary journeys, and after everything he's endured, he could have been like, the heck with y'all, I ain't doing nothing. I don't have to do that. I don't have to prove myself. I don't have to bend over backwards to show these unthankful Jews that, I'm not doing things that I'm accused of. But he says, you know what? All right. What's a week of purification and, paying the expenses for their consummation sacrifice of their Nazirite vows? Again, that tells us the attitude of Paul and much of the early Christians. And so, the next day, purifying himself with them, entered in the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews, which were of Asia. Now, where is Asia? Where is Asia in relation to Paul's missionary journey? Yep. On the western side of what is modern-day Turkey. Right here. See the area highlighted in red here? And in particular, we're going to see that these are Jews from Ephesus, which is kind of noteworthy because we've seen that Paul had been in Ephesus for 3 years and things were getting a little rocky when he left. And that probably is part of the reason why, when he's on his way back, he stops at Miletus instead of going on into Ephesus. But that's what persecution is. The word persecution, and I'm not sure that I've totally unpacked it, but the word persecution is linked back to the Hebrew word radaf, which obviously translate over into Greek, but it means to pursue. It's going beyond disliking someone. It is making an extended effort to pursue them in order to make their life more difficult. Or in many cases in the first century, to end their life, to cut them off, to silence them once and for all. And we can see here that there are Jews that were from Asia. Watch what happens here in verse 27. When they saw him in the temple, they stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people," the Jews, "and the law, and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place." And then watch what Luke adds here as a parenthetical. "For they had seen him before in Jerusalem, with him in the city, Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed," say supposed, who they supposed or assumed that Paul had brought into the temple. And so they're trying to use that as something they can cause an uproar with. And because it's at the timing of the Feast of Pentecost, they know that if they can incite an uproar, just like we've read somewhere else maybe, like the end of all four Gospels, where their goal was to create an uproar so that they could ultimately have what? Jesus crucified to stop the uproar, because the Roman authorities that were appointed to preside over Judea would do anything and everything to preserve their job, even if that means killing the innocent. Whatever it took to maintain their position, their status, their job security, they were willing to do. And so the Jews knew that. The Jews are very sharp people. Did you know that? They're very intelligent, very calculative. And many times that was to the disadvantage of early Christians. And so they had plotted against Paul. And they had come all the way from Ephesus in a time of antiquity where travel is not that easy in late spring, early summer, going across the Mediterranean. And they have come from Ephesus to enact vengeance on Paul, because they feel like Paul has preached against their traditions, which would have been very much true. But they had twisted how Paul would have preached. They had added to it. Right? They had to make the story juicier in order to compel others to create an uproar. And so one of the things they do is, well, we've seen Trophimus from Ephesus, because we know Trophimus because we're from Ephesus too. And we know that he traveled with Paul to Jerusalem, and we've seen them together. So here's a plausible accusation that we can bring against Paul that we know is guaranteed to solicit a riot. And that is that he brought a Gentile into the temple main courtyard. And undoubtedly, if you study in the writings of the first century, you will see that over in this area right here, the Gentiles could come. But there was a 4-foot wall right over here that you really can't see that had a sign. And they have actually found it in recent years that has been excavated that said, basically, in summary, if you're a Gentile and you enter into the temple, you are responsible for your death. Because it was a big no-no for a Gentile to enter into the temple. And so they knew that if they used that, Paul's a dead man. Because Paul is not only teaching against Moses and the Torah and the Jewish people and the temple and the priesthood, but he even was brazen enough to bring a Gentile, an uncircumcised heathen from Ephesus, into God's house, the Beit HaMikdash. That would have been certain death. A death that the Romans would even turn a blind eye to and allow to happen. Because it was known that Gentiles do not enter into the temple. Okay? And so, watch what happens here. Verse 30. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. If you're looking at the map here, they would have taken him out into what would be the court of the Gentiles over in this area, just right outside the temple, because it was a no-no to shed blood in the temple. There was no blood to be shed in the temple except the sacrifices that were to be given. And so, you know, they were committed to their traditions enough. They weren't going to kill Paul in the temple. They were at least going to drag him out, right? Do you see how crazily blind they are in keeping their traditions, but it doesn't bother them all to kill a man based on assumption and accusation? It's crazy. It's crazy. This is exactly what Jesus came to do away with, that type of mindset. but even he couldn't. You know why? Because we have choice. If God's will were to happen, everyone would be saved. Everyone would follow Christ. Everyone would obey him. And life here on planet Earth would be quite nice. But he doesn't force us. He's provided it. He's given it freely. But as we've seen throughout Paul's missionary journeys, few will accept it. Few will embrace it. And it's unfortunate because of the price that it cost Christ. And so they draw him out of the temple and they shut the doors. 31. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came to the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. Now I want you to look at the map and you can understand how this would have happened. They drag him out in this courtyard of the Gentiles. And if you'll look over here in this corner of the Temple Mount, okay, this way's north, this way's east. This would be the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. You have four, you can't really see the fourth one behind this tallest pillar, but we have what's called the Antonia Fortress. And this is where the Romans would have stationed rulers, high-ranking, as we see here, a chief captain, who would be a leader of a cohort, which was basically upwards towards as many as over 1,000 officers. And so he would be the chief captain, and there would be about 6 other officers that would be associated with this cohort. And under those officers would be centurions. And so you would have available to the governor of Judea 5 cohorts. And so during the time of the feast, they would have added security here, because most of the time there would only be a portion, say 1 cohort, maybe up to 1,000 Roman soldiers. But in the time of a feast, there would be more. They would likely have double. So you could say possibly up to 2,000 Roman soldiers. And then you would have the chief captain, Chiliarchos, which means basically a ruler of 1,000, who would be the ruler. And he's looking from the Antonia Fortress. Okay? And so you can see it ain't that far. I'm trying to say, okay, how far would this be? It would be the equivalency of less than looking across a football field, having been on the Temple Mount, just to give you a visual. And so they would have been able to see, people are going nuts down there. What's going on? Which was not totally uncommon, because anytime you have a feast and thousands of people from different backgrounds and different locations that meet together in one place and things are tight and packed, crazy things can happen. And so they see there's an uproar, and the Jews they're beating the snot out of Paul. Their intention is to kill Paul, to do away with him. But word travels fast. The soldiers obviously would have parted the way. And watch what happens. It says, who immediately took soldiers and centurions being officers that would have presided over, presumably, around a round number of 100 soldiers, and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. Right? Good idea. Because he's the guy in charge here. Right? And they recognize that and they know that. And so Paul's life is spared because he is seen being beaten from the Antonia Fortress. In verse 33 says, the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. So his assumption would be is Paul's the problem. Obviously, everybody's mad at Paul. It's pretty unanimous here. And so he has him bound with 2 chains and demanded who he was and what he had done. And watch what happens in verse 34, and it's going to sound eerily similar to something we've read at the end of the Gospels. And some cried one thing, some another, among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried to the castle. The castle would be the Antonia fortress. Okay, so I want you to just visualize the whole courtyard, this whole Temple Mount just packed with people. And Roman soldiers just parting people out of the way, having Paul bound between these 2 Roman soldiers, working their way up towards the Antonia fortress. And I want you to pay a special attention to the stairway that goes up to the fortress, because it's going to become important, as we'll see here in just a moment. And so they're carrying him to the castle, and when he came upon the stairs, again, those stairs there, so it was that he was borne or carried to the soldiers for the violence of the people, which tells us that the people were still trying to harm Paul. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, what? Away with him. It seems like I've read that somewhere in my Bible before, right? Jesus. So you remember when Jesus told his apostles, his disciples on various occasions, what they've done to me and what they'll do to me, they'll do to you. So just be prepared. Resolve it in your minds that you're going to be faithful unto the end. Here we see it come to life. It becomes a reality. Here's where you put into practice what you have heard, what you have seen, what you have witnessed, and what you have preached. Now it's time to walk it out by faith, not knowing what is going to happen, because you're in the hands of authorities of which we will see clearly are not of the utmost character. They're out for themselves. They are self-preservists, like most of society in any era of any time of human existence. And so they're crying out, away with him. Verse 37, and as Paul was to be led into the castle, as they're going up the stairs, he said to the chief captain, may I speak unto you? And the captain is amazed, watch this, who said, can you speak Greek? Are not you that Egyptian, which before these days made an uproar, and you led out in the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? Which tells us that one of the accusations about Paul was likely what? What we just read. Because why would he assume that? Paul would have looked like a Jew. You know why? Because he was a Jew, right? Okay, so why would he assume that? And who is he talking about? We actually have other witness evidence, the writings of Josephus, who writes about this particular Egyptian. He writes a little bit more loosely, because he says 30,000 men were led out in the wilderness versus Luke's more conservative 4,000. But when you go back and you trace the history of what is being referenced here, several years before this, about 3 years before this event that we're reading here, there was an Egyptian who gained a following out in the wilderness, who came to Jerusalem and gathered a bunch of people on the Mount of Olives and declared that he was going to cause the walls to fall flat. Kind of like the Jericho story. Well, when the governor caught wind of it, you know what he did? He sent Roman soldiers over and they killed him. Or they killed much of his followers, but he escaped. Okay? He got away. And so because this Egyptian's out roaming around and has been for several years. He escaped. Some of the accusations would have been from others. This is the Egyptian who caused the uproar, right? Anything to get him killed, they're willing to say, right? I mean, they're not going to spill blood on the temple, inside the temple court, in the main court, right? They're going to preserve their traditions, but they're willing to lie like dogs once they get outside of the temple. Anything to kill Paul. Oh, goodness gracious. And so, when Paul speaks fluent Greek, because he's highly educated, the captain's shocked. He's like, oh, you mean you're not the Egyptian who had the following of 4,000 men, and it says that were murderers. That word murderers is Sukari, which means bearers of the dagger. And what these people were known or notorious for, and they were very good at it, and why they would have used this against Paul in this situation, is the Sukari carried daggers in their garments that were easy to conceal. And in a time of a crowded place, whoever was an authority or an aristocrat or somebody that they envied or hated, when they got in a big crowd and got around them, they would secretly pull out their dagger and they would kill them. And they would do it in a quick and concealed way that they would put their weapon away and they would cry out like the rest of the crowd. And the rest of the crowd wouldn't know who killed the person that obviously the dagger bearer killed. And they rarely, if ever, were caught in doing this. This was a practice they had perfected. And so this would be an applicable time for them to bring this up because it's a time of crowded festivities, Feast of Pentecost. And so they used this against Paul. Crazy. In verse 39, but Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city or no insignificant city. In other words, he was politely saying, I'm not an Egyptian, I'm an educated Jew, and I'm from a prominent city, a city that's known for its education and learning, which would have set the chief captain back because he's assumed he's this Egyptian who caused all this commotion a few years prior. And obviously, there's another uproar that's going on that surrounds him. Watch what he says. I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, so he consents because of his ability to speak Greek well. And Paul stood on the stairs. So I want you to just visualize just shoulder to shoulder people. And Paul standing upon the stairs. It's not quite the platform we imagine, is it? But it's still a platform. I hope you get this. Even in Paul's situation, the focus is not himself. In the midst of this commotion, Paul's thinking, man, now would be a great time for me to share Jesus. If I can just convince this guy who's taking me to the castle to let me talk to these Jews. It's one of those Selah moments. So Paul climbs to the top of the stairs, or he's carried to the top of the stairs, and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And the beckoning of the hand that would have been to silence the crowd would be this. This was the common gesture. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, and more likely, it says in the Hebrew tongue, it's most likely that in his public address he would have spoken Aramaic, which is a sister language, but it was the spoken language, whereas Hebrew dominated as the written language in the first century, as the Dead Sea Scrolls make irrefutable. And so he speaks to them in Aramaic, which is important to know because the chief captain would not understand what he says, which will explain his response, as we'll see here in just a moment. And so he says, men, brethren, and fathers, which is a way you address what? Fellow Jews. Hear my defense, my apology. This is apologetics right here. Which I now make unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And he said, I am verily a man, which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, which was one of the most famous Jewish rabbis known to Israel, which tells us a little bit about Paul's upbringing. Although he was born in Tarsus, he would have been taken to Israel at some point for a formal education and advanced training in Judaism. And obviously we see here that he studied under one of the most famous teachers of Israel, Gamaliel, which we've seen earlier in Acts, who basically told the religious leaders, if it's of God, no one can stand against it. He was known to be very moderate, not as zealous as we've seen Paul as a Torah observant Jew in his earlier years before his conversion. But that's who Paul would have sat under, likely from the age of 13 at least till the age of 18 or 19. And he would have resided in Jerusalem. And just a little bit of history about the first century. By the time the boys were 5, they were expected to be ready for memorization and learning of the Torah. And obviously they would have embedded in them from birth the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and about how we are to love the Lord with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength above everything. And then, they would advance to 13. They would have their bar mitzvah, which is the coming of age, where they are responsible for the keeping of the commandments that they have learned up until that point. And those who would advance or appear to be very intelligent or very zealous or interested in the law or study of the law would sometimes be given the opportunity to go on into one of these schools, a Beit Midrash, and they would be able to study and possibly become teachers or rabbis themselves. And so he would have been of the Pharisee tradition, as we see Paul say elsewhere in his other writings himself. But pointing out here that he was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel would have been obvious to them, knowing that he would have been a Pharisee by his upbringing. What does it mean that he sat at the feet of Gamaliel? That is a euphemism or Hebraism for basically he was a student of this particular rabbi. Because in their settings, what they had is the rabbi would always be seated and his students would always be seated on the floor in a posture of honor and submission, because it's very big in that culture. And Jesus even echoes that when he says, what to his disciples? The disciple is never above his teacher. And so that would have been a very Jewish train of thought. And so the euphemism fits well here. He says, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, which would be the Mishnah, the oral Torah, Torah Shebe'al Peh, which is the Torah by word of mouth. Obviously, this was in large part made up traditions that were added to the keeping of the Mosaic law that was in the form of writing in Genesis through Deuteronomy. And so he says he was zealous toward God as you are all this day. In other words, Paul is painting the picture in that I used to be everything you were and more. So he's identifying with where they're at as far as thinking and ideology. In other words, he's saying, I can relate. Been there, done that, and more. Okay? In verse 4, he said, and I persecuted this way, or more appropriately, the way, which is the teaching of the apostles, as we see in the Didache, right? I've given everyone a copy of that if you want to download it from our Facebook group. So I persecuted the way unto death, which speaks of his zeal, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. And there would have been many people in Jerusalem that would have known this about Paul. And he says that. Watch this, verse 5. As also the high priest doth bear me witness in all the estate of the elders, the Sanhedrin. So he's pointing out that the high priest, which when Paul was persecuting Christians, would have been Caiaphas. At this time, there's been half a dozen or so high priests since Caiaphas, and I think the high priest at this time was a high priest by the name of Ananias, which is not to be confused with the one we read about in the Gospels, Annas. But he's basically pointing out the religious authorities know who I am. Okay? And he says, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. So he's recalling how he used to persecute the Christian movement, which he is now a part of. And he's talking about how he was doing that here in verse 5, how he was going to exact punishment on those who were followers of the way, something they are actually doing as he spoke. Verse 6. And it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come near unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying unto me, Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me? Which is exactly how it was depicted earlier in chapter 9 when Luke, as a narrator, is telling the story of this encounter that he has with the risen Christ. And before I forget, hopefully everybody has a copy of the comparison of Paul's conversion story as is narrated in chapter 9, as he is speaking here himself in chapter 22, and as we'll see again, he'll speak in chapter 26. And much to do has been made over some of the small differences, as if he's going to tell the exact verbatim story each time that it's told. Because he only tells it himself twice, and Luke tells it for him another time. So you're not going to have one-to-one correspondence and every minute detail be the same in his recollection of this experience and encounter. But you can look at that by way of study on your own time. We're not going to focus on that because I really find it to be pretty irrelevant. And so, again, the Lord Christ asks why he is persecuting him, which, again, tells us how Jesus views it when real Christians are being persecuted. He views it as what? Persecution against himself. Okay? Which is why we allow vengeance to be in his hands. Because ultimately, if we represent his name, when people persecute us or come against us, they're coming against who? The Christ in us, the Christ we represent in his name that we bear. And so we see that reflected here. And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you persecute. How many of you think he had Paul's undivided attention? And they that were with me saw indeed the light, and were afraid. But they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And so we're not exactly sure if they heard anything and just didn't understand that it was the voice of Christ who is conversing with Paul. But he does say that they saw the light and they were afraid, but they did not hear the voice, which could be similar to what we see in the Gospels, I think in John chapter 12, where God speaks over Christ and talks about how he's going to glorify him. And it says that some heard it as what? Thunder. They didn't recognize the voice, but they thought they heard thunder. So we don't know if they heard something or not, and the Greek doesn't make it clear, so we just don't know. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, repeat after me. I saw, take you, Jesus, into my heart. I'm being facetious here, obviously. He asked Jesus, what shall I do? As a proper response to this revealing of yourself. Not what must I believe, not what must I confess, not what must I pray. How shall I properly respond in action to this revealing of yourself? And notice Jesus doesn't say, you don't have to do anything, Brother Saul. Jesus done everything for you. You just pray this prayer. Everything will be all right. When you come to heaven, it's going to be great. Your life's going to be wonderful. Everybody's going to love you. No, that's not there. You know why? Because God never wanted that to be a part of Christianity. And people actually have trouble with the seeing that's glaringly absent from the biblical text that we claim to believe. It's amazing how things get passed over when people are passive bystanders and refuse to read the Word of God for themselves. They'll believe anything. Right? That's why we all are commanded to study for ourselves, right? And we encourage you to do so as often as we can. And the Lord said unto me, arise, go to Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. We know that one of the things that the Lord revealed to him is that he would suffer for his name's sake. And Paul was willing to do that. He says, and when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came to Damascus. And one, Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, which is different than the account that Luke narrates, because he doesn't give us this information that would lead us to believe that Ananias was a Torah-observant Jew, a very pious Jew. But Paul is pointing this out because of the audience that he is speaking to. Okay, he's trying to identify where he can with his fellow Jews. And so, verse 13 says, he came unto me and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. In the same hour I looked up upon him. And he said, the God of our fathers has chosen you, that you should know his will, and see that just one, which is exactly how Peter preached him or presented him in Acts chapter 3, after the lame man was healed. Same audience. That Jesus must be viewed as the just one or the righteous one. This would be a clear reference to the one who was prophesied by the prophets as the Mashiach, the Messiah, and should hear the voice of his mouth. This is where he's getting on dangerous ground, because he's saying we're all supposed to listen to Jesus because he is the fulfillment. He is that prophet of whom Moses himself prophesied would come, that we should hear in Deuteronomy. For you shall be his witness. Verse 15, you shall be his witness unto all men of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you tarry? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord, which would be invoking trust in Christ and following him. Notice that baptism is important. There are a lot of people in modern culture that want to be dismissive of the necessity of baptism, as if you could shun it and still be a follower of Christ. That's not true. We don't see any evidence of that in the New Testament. We are commanded to be baptized, right? And obviously, if you're in a situation, a lot of people want to throw out, well, the thief on the cross wasn't baptized. That's a really stupid argument, number one, because he couldn't have been. But had he had the opportunity to be baptized, would God have expected him to be baptized? And the obvious answer is, of course he would have, because he commanded it. I mean, when does his commands become optional for certain people and not for others? Right? In the new covenant, he hit the apply all button. Right? If you love me, keep my commandments. If you love me, keep my commandments. And they're not going to be grievous. In other words, no one's going to have to twist your arm to do it. You want to do it. Why would you want to do it? Because you have a regenerated heart. You have the mind of Christ. You are following in his footsteps. You want to do the will of God. And why would you not want to? So again, I point that out because there is a lot of people that are claiming you don't have to be baptized. It's not important. You don't have to be baptized to be saved. Well, that's just not supported in the Bible. Now, can salvation, let's say it this way. This is more appropriate. Can you receive the Holy Spirit before you're baptized in water? Yes, we've seen that in Acts. But were they always baptized after that? Yes. Why? Because it was the Lord's command. And it was a public declaration, a visual image for the public of associating yourself with the Jesus movement. And it had a lot of things that it represented as a picture. As he says here, be baptized and wash away your sins. Because it very much is a picture of what that is like. What coming to Christ is like. Are y'all with me? Verse 17. And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance. Now, when would he be referring to this encounter? If you go back into Acts chapter 9, the end of the latter part of that chapter, you'll see that Luke talks about Paul coming to Jerusalem. Paul gives us clarity, thankfully, in the letter that he writes to the churches of Galatia. And he says, it wasn't until 3 years after my conversion that I went to Jerusalem, and I was only there for 2 weeks. Right? He talks about that in Galatia as he opens his letter. And so, while he was there during that time, evidently, as he says here, while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying unto me, make haste and get quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. Which makes sense, and I encourage you to do this, when you go back and look and see what it says in chapter 9. Because in chapter 9 it talks about Paul leaving Jerusalem because essentially there was backlash because he was disputing about the law. Okay, so go check it out. And so the Lord basically says, get out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the outer garments of them that killed him. It's crazy, isn't it? Whoops. Verse 22. And they gave him audience unto this word. Whoops. 21. In verse 21, this is where he really is going to tick them off. And he said unto me, depart, for I will send you to the Gentiles. And they lose it. They lose it. You know why they lose it? Because we're the people of God. This is our temple. This is our priesthood. We have the Torah and circumcision. We pretty much worship the temple. Don't mess with our traditions. Don't include anyone else. We don't want anyone else in. Are you seeing this? Watch what happens. And they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices. In other words, they listened to him thus far, and then they were like, no, sir. Because he's not even near done with his speech, if you know Paul, right? And then lifted up their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, which is a way of saying he doesn't deserve to breathe air. For it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes, their outer garments, and threw dust in the air. I mean, these people have lost their minds, right? I mean, just visualize it. He's on the stairway, just sharing his testimony. And when he gets to the part of the testimony that it's bigger than y'all think it is, God wants to include more people than you think he does, they lose it. And they start chunking their clothes. They start grabbing dirt and throwing it up in the air. They probably wanted to throw stones, but, he was standing there by the chief captain. But they're making a big deal of it. Verse 24. Now remember, the chief captain is watching this, but he don't know what he's saying. Right? He's speaking in Aramaic. The officer would have known Latin, Greek, but not Aramaic enough to follow this conversation. And so the chief captain, verse 24, commanded him to be brought into the castle, the Antonia fortress, and that he should be examined by scourging. This particular scourging, was basically done to criminals when they were unwilling to disclose information. Like, you've seen some of the action movies where a hero is captured and they take them and they torture them trying to get information out of them, right? That's the principle here. But this flogging was a flogging that would have involved items that looked like any of these. These are knuckle bones from animals that would have been sharp bones that were put on these heavy-duty strands that would beat. This particular whip has lead weights on it. To give you a picture of what type of beating this would look like, imagine putting 2 or 3 to 4 ounce fishing weights on heavy-duty leather straps and just flogging the fire out of somebody. And this would be done by Roman soldiers who were as fit as anyone, right? And what they would do is they would beat them to get the information that they wanted. And if they didn't get the information they wanted, they'd keep beating. whether you had information to share or not. And oftentimes this beating would leave one crippled for life, and in many cases it would kill them. Very, very inhumane, because once they start beating, they just kind of flip a switch and just go into barbarian mode. When you study the Romans in the first century, they were brutal. And so the chief officer, what is he assuming here? Paul's obviously the problem. He don't understand the conversation, but everyone is mad at him, right? So what is his agenda? I want to keep peace. Because if I keep peace, I preserve my job, right? Job security. So the easy solution is, let's just beat the dog out of this guy and get to the root of why is he causing so much trouble? Because at this point, it's very much up in the air. And so the chief commanded him to be brought to the castle and bade him that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. Verse 25, and as they bound him with thongs, and they stretch him out. They're stretching him out, and they're fixing to just beat the dog out of him. And Paul pulls out the trump card. Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, I like the way he does it too. Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? You talk about having his undivided attention, which brings the question, why? Because he would have been of a higher status likely than the centurion himself, being a freedman Roman citizen. Furthermore, against Roman policy, it was illegal to even bind a Roman citizen before a proper trial, much less pull them out ready to beat them. So this centurion's like, oh, job security mode, right? He's like, oh no, job's in danger. Must back up fast, right? He wants to preserve his own tail here. And so watch what happens. Verse 26, when the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what you do, for this man's a Roman. In other words, let's not screw this up. Let's keep our jobs. Because he says he's a Roman citizen. Verse 27, then the chief captain came and said unto him, tell me, are you a Roman? He said, yeah. And the chief captain answered, with a great sum obtained I this freedom. Well now, tell us a little bit more about yourself. What's he saying? I bought my status as a Roman citizen, which was not the proper way to go about it. Let's just say that. And so this is me speaking here, okay? I think he threw it out there hoping that Paul had purchased his Roman citizenship, and which would mean that Paul could do what? Buy his way out of this situation, possibly. That's just me, okay? The text doesn't say this. We don't know. But why would he say that? This is the chief captain, right? A high-ranking officer saying, I had to buy this freedom. Bribery. That's how he obtained his citizenship. And Paul said, but I was freeborn. Whoa. The stakes just got even higher. Paul was a legitimate born Roman citizen, which was very rare for a Jew to be such. And likely this would be obtained by either Paul's parents or grandparents being bought out of slavery in the Roman area that they lived, Tarsus presumably, and he would have obtained that status by that means. There are other means possible as well. Either his parents or grandparents could have served in the Roman military and received an honorable discharge and thus gained their family Roman citizenship. But that was a drawn out process, and that wasn't always achieved by everyone. Another possibility is the establishment of a Roman colony in the particular place where he lived, Tarsus, which led to the instant enfranchisement of goodly number of persons in various places in the empire. This likely is not applicable to where he's from. So again, the most plausible answer is that his parents were bought out of slavery, which explains his connection to the synagogue of what? We're going way back in Acts. The synagogue of what? Freedmen. Remember that back in the earlier chapters in Acts? The libertines. This would be people connected to that. So, he is even of a higher status than the chief officer, which makes all of the Roman authorities very careful and very nervous. Because again, they've already went past the point that they're supposed to concerning a Roman citizen. And so, verse 29, then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him, the interrogators who would have beat the snot out of him. And the chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. And that's where we're going to stop right there. So, any questions?
Peggy has asked online, at age 13 bar mitzvah, would that be where many get age of accountability as 12?
It was different for girls and boys. You had the bat mitzvah for girls at age 12 and the bar mitzvah for the boys at age 13. So, girls, y'all evolve quicker.
Is that why they're basing age of accountability?
Age of accountability because bar mitzvah literally translated is son of the commandment. Mitzvah is commandment, and that means the age where you're responsible to keep the commands for yourself. And so that was just the normal age for development. I believe that in the first century, as far as the Israelite culture, and really throughout the duration of the existence of the Mosaic Law, I think the Israeli culture, I think the children developed and understood quicker about the reality of life and the things of God much quicker than, say, in our culture today. Because they would have been more immersed in it. They would have been more exposed to how the world works, agriculture, the environment, etc. And there was a higher price that was put in the Israeli culture on teaching children, right? One of the commandments in the Shema in Deuteronomy is from the time you get up till they go to bed, you teach them the commandments, the ways of the Lord. Where, it goes into the hyperbole of, bind it on your hands and on your forehead and on your doorpost. That's how important it is to instruct your children in the ways of the Lord. So, again, they would have developed and been very mature to the point where they have their bar and bat mitzvah, they're ready to procreate. And many of them did at that age. I mean, as soon as they had their bar and bat mitzvah, it's time to have babies, to get married. Marriages were arranged, people were married, and they started a family. And, it sounds foreign to our culture, but they had a greater success rate in marriage than we do today.
She's clarifying, not Jews, but denominations. Do you think that's where they draw that kind of from, I guess?
Yeah, I would say so. Denominations would draw a lot of information from, obviously, Christianity coming out of Judaism. There's a lot of transferables, sometimes appropriately and sometimes not appropriately. But yeah, that's probably where a lot of churches would get that from. Any others?
But yet bells weren't counted until they were 20, I mean, as far as in number.
What's that?
Doesn't it talk about in the Bible where they would number the men, but they didn't number them until they were 20?
There were different purposes for numbering. Sometimes we're numbering for military, sometimes for more of just a general consensus. So it would depend on what you were talking about, and things evolved and things changed over time, for sure. So there's not one age that would be applicable to every circumstance of numbering throughout the history of Israel. So very, very mixed. And coming back from the exile, a lot of things changed from that point forward, moving into the first century and the world that Christ stepped into. I mean, you had a major paradigm shift in Israel from the destruction of the first temple, the exile, them coming back, the rise of the Babylonian, Medes and Persians, the Grecian Empire with Alexander the Great conquering the known world in like mind-boggling time. It's amazing how quickly he just dominated the known world and spread the Hellenistic culture. And then that was followed up immediately by Rome. And that's the world that Jesus stepped into and the Bible comes out of, or the New Testament comes out of. So a lot of things going on there that changed over time. Any more questions?
We've talked about Paul's family, obviously were free, but, and I know you mentioned that they would have had this shown, basically in excelling in the scriptures to be sent, but was money also a factor probably?
Money would be a factor because you would have to have some money to be able to travel in antiquity as they did, and then to be involved in these type of schools, and be sustained. So that tells us a little bit about Paul's earlier status in life. And much like Luke, he comes from probably, obviously, above the poorer class, so he can obviously condescend and deal with the poor on a regular basis and be quite comfortable with that, which is what we're called to do as Christians. So he certainly, when he writes in his letters, I've abounded and I've been abased. In other words, I've had plenty and I've done without, but I've learned, whatever the circumstances, to be content, no matter what. Obviously, he's speaking as a Christian when he writes that. But yeah, he definitely experienced a lot in his life. Any other questions?
I have one more too.
Okay.
Like, how many years would have passed between, let's say, from this moment versus when he, stood there by Stephen? Because my thought was, as you're talking about that part, does not anyone remember, as he's, how many? But I need to know how many years.
You're looking at about 25 years.
Okay, so
25 years from the time of Stephen to the time of this particular.
it's a while.
Yeah, no doubt that there would have been people in Jerusalem that would have been familiar. As he talks about, the Sanhedrin and the high priest, those of the priestly class would be able to know who Paul is. Even though they may not recognize him because he's not spent much time in Jerusalem since his persecution, as he writes in Galatia, they would have known who he was. There was a stir around Paul's name, not, as we've seen, not only from those who are part of Judaism, but even those who are part of Jewish Christianity. He had opponents pretty much everywhere he turned. And so, again, very thankful and very grateful for the things that the Apostle Paul went through against all odds and toughing it out, man. When I get to heaven, guarantee it. That a boy. There's a lot of people I'm going to find. They're all going to take a back seat to the one who wore those crown of thorns and took those nails, though. Any other questions?